The views and opinions expressed here are those of the guests and are not the official position of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
One of the most remarkable aspects of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. The purpose of the Church Historic Sites program is to strengthen the faith of church members and interest others in the restored gospel by increasing visitors' understanding of the significant events, buildings, and sites in church history and the gospel principles associated with them. Joining me today are Emily Utt, Michael Landon, and Mel Bayshore, all of the Church History Department. Is that right?
Yep.
Very good. And most recently, you three have been working on what? Tell me what's going on. First, let's have you go around and introduce yourselves. You've all been here before, but for our listeners, let's find out again who you are and what you do.
I'm Mel Bayshore. I've worked with the Historic Sites now for 2 years. Currently working on a research for the Martins Cove Mormon Trail Historic Site Guide.
Very good. Emily?
Emily Utt. I've been with the Church History Department for about 5 years now, and I'm currently working on a historic site guide for the Beehive House, new interpretive information for the missionaries serving there.
Very good.
And I'm Mike Landon, and I have been working in historic sites. My assignment might change soon, but I've been working on a project related to the Mormon Battalion Visitor Center in San Diego that's going to be reopening, I should say, in January.
Excellent. Sounds like
January.
You three are staying very, very busy. Today we're discussing specifically a publication that was made for missionaries serving in St. George area and the church history sites that are down there. Tell me a little bit about this publication and what its purpose is.
I'm taking that one, aren't I?
Okay, go ahead.
So missionaries serving at historic sites, most of them don't have a background in history. They're missionaries just like anywhere else in the world, and so then they're sent to a historic site and expected to give a 45-minute tour on the history of the St. George Tabernacle, and they have nothing to share. And so we write scripts, in a sense, for them. We write the information that they need. They can then take and turn into something that the visitors can understand. And so we've spent the last about 18 months working on a guide for the 4 sites that we interpret in St. George. That's the St. George Temple, the St. George Tabernacle, the Brigham Young Winter Home, and the Jacob Hamblin Home. The church has a couple of other sites in southern Utah, including the Mount Meadows Massacre site and the Pine Valley Chapel, but that was a little bit outside the work that we were doing. So we kind of touched on those, but we really focused on the 4 sites that missionaries currently staff. And most church members, when I tell them what project we were working on, kind of look at me oddly, like they didn't know these places existed. They think Church Historic Sites only deals with sites of the restoration that Joseph Smith lived in, so Palmyra and Nauvoo and Kirtland, and not realizing that historic sites also help church members understand how the gospel relates to them. So we can go to the Jacob Hamblin Home and learn what it was like to be an average church member and the sacrifices they made to build the kingdom and the lessons we can learn from that sacrifice.
Excellent. Tell me about the process of coming up with this guide, what it takes, what your involvement each was. Michael? Well,
we actually had to decide, in a way, are we all going to do these individual historic sites as a group, or are we going to divide these up? And we, in a sense, did them as a group, but we sort of had a lead person on each one of them. We'd oftentimes come across information that was useful to one of our colleagues in working on a particular site, and we would share that information. But we each sort of keyed on a specific site and sort of took lead responsibility for doing the research and trying to craft a document that would be useful for people who have to interpret the site when visitors come to see it.
And so this is specifically for missionaries? Mm-hmm. It's not going to be generally public type document?
The public is the secondary audience for this. So it starts with the missionaries. They understand it and internalize it and then share it
And that's how members could learn about it, is go to take the tours.
Go take the tours.
Excellent.
And the first thing that we really do when we start this is we sit down and brainstorm what the key ideas are for these sites. What are the most important stories? What are the most important ideas that we want people to understand about this area of church history? And then we just dive into the research. We spent probably almost a year just doing research, going through the St. George Stake manuscript histories, reading journals, looking at old photographs, just covering as wide of a base as we could, and not really looking at secondary sources, not really analyzing books written by people in the last 20 years. We wanted to get back to the original sources and really understand this story from the perspective of the people that were living it and going through those events.
So let's...
I think one thing, that was very important and very helpful to us was we spent several days down at the sites specifically asking the missionaries what their experiences were, what the general questions that they asked, what they needed help on in terms of answering questions. It was very useful to meet with the missionaries and to hear the challenges that they faced in trying to interpret these sites.
And as Emily said, as I look through this guide, it appears you've actually given them goals, whatever is the right word, to what people need to know about these places and to what they can come away knowing and learning from them as well. Very interesting. Let's go to why St. George is there. I mean, it's not very close to Salt Lake City, and somebody had to eventually have a reason to go to St. George. Can somebody just give me a real
I can give you a little
history?
background on that. Parley P. Pratt, 1850, they had an exploring expedition that went throughout the state essentially to find out what was here, to look for places that could be settled, what resources could be developed. And the Pratt expedition went through the area where St. George is now and saw its potential for raising cotton, sugarcane, crops that had long growing seasons, and brought that report back to Brigham Young. And so there was a great interest. Brigham Young didn't actually go down and visit the St. George area until 11 years after that Pratt expedition went. But he saw the potential to try and develop the resources in the state. That's kind of the beginning of it. But St. George has a climate that in the winter is probably great, but during the summer can just be ferocious with the heat. And so it was like pulling teeth. Brigham Young had a great desire to develop that potential as a cotton-growing area. But it was like pulling teeth to try and find people who would go down there. And they really had to nudge people to get them to go.
It almost seemed like it was a pet project for Brigham, and yet it was very difficult to get people to commit to take the mission call.
Mm-hmm. It was a project that never really succeeded. The Cotton Mission was around from the 1850s to about, 1900? And never really had the growth that Brigham Young was hoping for. But in the end, it really became an area where Brigham Young sent people that were devoted disciples of the church, that were willing to sacrifice and do anything that needed to be done. And some of those people went to St. George, to grow cotton, and some of them left after a year because it was just too hard. And other people, I still feel like, maybe have a mission call to St. George, that their great-great-great-grandfather was called to Southern Utah, and they're going to stick it out until the prophet calls them back, that they are in Southern Utah because the prophet wanted them there, and they're going to do whatever they need to do to fulfill that call.
Yeah, I think many people, I think that's right, Emily, that people did go down and fulfilled what I think Brigham Young's great hope. He knew that if they made a success of the cotton growing, that this could make people rich, and he was not interested in having people go down there just to become wealthy. He wanted to grow saints, not just cotton. And southern Utah, Dixie, did that. It grew saints. And so he was very much interested, as much in developing the resources of southern Utah. He was very much interested in building the kingdom.
And in fact, he also established the Southern Indian Mission at about the same time. In the April 1855 conference, he called a number of individuals to go down to labor among the Paiutes and the other Indians that were living in the southern part of the territory. So there was a missionary spiritual dimension in terms of a mission. At the same time, he was calling people to do these more secular or temporal kinds of activities like growing cotton. So I think in Brigham Young's mind, they were one and the same. And that was tough as well.
Yeah, those Indian missionaries were the first ones to grow cotton down there in 1855. They grew a small crop and saw that could be viable. And so it was, 1857 that they established the town of Washington. And Brigham Young reached out to the people in the territory and asked them if they would notify him if they had experience in growing cotton, and then called those people who had that experience, mostly people who had joined the church in the southern states, to go down to start this cotton growing mission.
And then October Conference of 1861, they opened the mission called to St. George for the town of St. George, and about 300 families were called. So most of them were called by name from General Conference. So they were sitting in the meeting. Brigham Young says their name. You are now going to St. George. Pack your bags. You have about a month to get ready. And then they also called a bunch of Swiss settlers who had just recently arrived from Switzerland, and they were sent down at the same time to build, again, the cotton mission, which was probably a bit of a shock to them, being from Switzerland and having no idea how to, first off, live in a dry climate, and then second, to grow cotton.
Well, to come from Switzerland to the Salt Lake Valley, I mean, that in and of itself was a stark contrast. But then to go down to southern Utah, that must have been, they must have thought they were on the moon in terms of the environment that they were coming into, because it was so out of their frame of reference to what they knew during their previous lives.
And so it appears that it was the faith and the conviction of the people actually called by the prophet that made them stay. It wasn't cotton, because the cotton didn't happen. Why was the cotton not a success? Was it just the heat, or was it? Do we know?
I don't know if we really know.
I don't know if we really know.
I think probably part of it was the water problem in southern Utah. Anyone who's been to St. George or southern Utah in general knows how difficult it is to find water. The area is prone to, because it is so dry, when it rains, it floods.
All or nothing.
All or nothing. And that's not really a good environment to be growing to be growing crops like cotton and other things that have a long growing season but need kind of constant water. It was just a lot of work, really, and the climate is so harsh that it was difficult for people to just support themselves. They needed to first off to be growing crops that they could be using to feed their families and to feed their animals. And so cotton kind of became a secondary crop for them, because they were, in some cases, starving in some seasons.
So they decided to build the St. George Temple. Do you think that was kind of a reward that the prophet wanted to give to the people for sticking it out in St. George?
Well, actually, the temple was one of the later projects. There were a number of large capital projects that they had started down there. In many respects, you could say that St. George, its viability rested on a public works project. You had the courthouse, you had the tithing yard, you had the tabernacle, and you had the cotton factory, all having to be built. And the labor force that's required to sustain those kinds of projects, of course, creates service industries, and you have to have resources to support the families who are working on the projects. The husbands who are working there, they had their families, and in a way, it's kind of a fascinating story because initially it was just the, say, Cedar to Washington was supposed to be the sort of the area in which tithing was going to be drawn from to sustain the labor force constructing these buildings. But it became quickly obvious that was not going to be sufficient. And so they began drawing on tithing reserves as far north as Beaver, and even down to Pipe Springs. The church had a cattle ranch down in that area that provided beef. And so it's really fascinating in some respects because there were communities that were providing resources to sustain these building projects who weren't going to really benefit in a sense of actually having the use of the buildings. And you could even say it was a redistribution of wealth and resources that was taking place in some fashion to help these buildings reach their completion. And so not only were the saints sacrificing to build them as they constructed them, but you had the outlying communities also sacrificing because they were helping to sustain those who were working on the buildings.
So didn't it go as far north as San Pete, too?
That's correct. It was, yeah.
So
San Pete.
Several 100-mile radius for
Right.
people not from southern Utah.
Helping keep St. George alive.
Yeah.
And it was not lost, the sacrifices of these outlying communities was not lost on the locals. In fact, it was Walker.
Charles Walker.
Charles Lowell Walker, who penned a poem when they were finishing the St. George Tabernacle, in which he paid tribute to the fact that they had survived on San Pete flour. It's sort of a tribute to those who had, given of their substance to help him and his fellow workers continue to finish the building.
Mike, tell them about the St. George Tabernacle. That's one of the first public works projects that became a great symbol of the Latter-day Saint community in that area.
That's true. I mean, really, if you think about the church edifices in St. George that are so significant, you have the temple and you have the tabernacle. The tabernacle was started in 1862, but it wasn't dedicated until the mid-1870s.
And people, the mission was established. St. George was established in 1861.
Right.
So only a year after they got there, they began this tremendous building.
It is remarkable. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the saints building the Kirtland Temple, and then
living in dugouts.
That's
while
right.
they're building
Exactly.
a tremendous building.
Or the Nauvoo Temple, same kind of concept.
And so it took quite a while to build the tabernacle. What was the reason?
Well,
for
there
that?
were several. One, again, being able to bring in enough resources to sustain the labor force became a problem. Some people became discouraged, and there were periods when they just didn't have enough of a labor force to continue the work. In fact, there was a meeting in which Erastus Snow held in 1866. He called everyone together, sort of recommit them to finishing the building. To recommence the work on the St. George Tabernacle, and he sort of asked people to affirm that they were going to help those who were going to be building it, and B, those who were building it to work diligently to get it done. The other problem is the resources to actually construct the building. Lumber, for example, became a very precious commodity because there were large mining interests in the area that came in, and they drove the price of available timber way up. The mills were just working constantly. And Latter-day Saints had to compete in the same market. You had particularly Pioche, large mining boom in not too far away in what is today present southern Nevada. And this competition for resources really stretched the ability to get the materials that they needed in order to finish the building in a timely fashion. So there were those kinds of things that, resources, labor force, people had to support their families. Sometimes they just couldn't do it. Or if the mines were offering a very handsome salary.
Would draw the workers away.
That's right. And Charles Lowell Walker often commented on, hey, I'm staying at my post. Some of my brethren may run off to the mines, but I'm going to stay here and do what I've been asked to do. So there was a winnowing, in essence, even among those who were constructing the building as it was going through.
As I understand it, Brother Brigham came down during the construction of the tabernacle, walked in, and with his carpenter's eye saw a problem. Can somebody tell me that story?
Well, Emily's probably better equipped to. She's investigated that some.
There's actually brings up a good point that a lot of stories that we have in the church are just part of our collective memory and aren't really verifiable by early documents. The tabernacle balcony is a good example of that. That there's so many stories that we just know as church members. We've heard our entire lives. Everybody has shared them. And one thing that we found, though, is we were going into this guide that we decided not to read any of those stories. We decided not to go into any of the secondary sources and only look at the primary information. And a lot of those stories that we've been sharing for years and understanding for years were not verifiable in the primary sources.
That doesn't necessarily imply that they're entirely false. It's just that they're not verifiable from available documentation at the time.
Primary sources.
Yeah. And so most of these stories have some kind of kernel of truth in them, but because we've been sharing them for 80 years, it's like the game of telephone where eventually details start changing and they get bigger and better as we go. And so these stories that we think we know, there's something in them that's true, but we found in writing this guide that we chose not to share most of them because they can't be verified in the primary sources. And there's several, actually, about every single building in St. George. And we will find them at every church historic site that we have to deal with, that there's always something going on. One interesting thing about the tabernacle is really understanding the purpose of why it was built. For most people think of Latter-day Saint communities and they think of the temple as in the center. But very few Latter-day Saint communities have a temple in them. Most Latter-day Saint towns have tabernacles in the middle, and St. George is one of those. The temple is several blocks away from the geographic center of the city. Just like here in Salt Lake City, where the Temple Square is the kind of the starting point for laying out the streets, in St. George, the tabernacle was the starting point for laying out the streets. And you find that repeated over and over again in these early settlements that Brigham Young founded. To me, it says that the tabernacle was going to be the center of these people's lives. Every major community event that took place in southern Utah took place in that tabernacle. Every prophet from Brigham Young to David O. McKay, David O. McKay has spoken in the St. George Tabernacle. The people gathered to the tabernacle much as they gather to the temple in larger towns. And the tabernacle was built with the same level of craftsmanship as the temple was built. It's a huge sandstone building out in the middle of the desert. So they pulled sandstone from a local quarry, found timber in Pine Valley, and then they had craftsmen go to work.
Mount Trumbull.
I thought Temple was Mount Trumbull. And then they brought craftsmen in from all over. They had people who were very good at woodworking. Miles Romney built a gorgeous spiral staircase in the St. George Tabernacle to accommodate people going up to the second floor. There's all kinds of beautiful hand-grained pine, much like you have in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, all over that building, just to really reinforce that this was a building that was special to the Latter-day Saints and was the center of their community. And in fact, they loved the St. George Tabernacle so much, they almost loved it to death. They held constant meetings from the 1870s until the 1920s.
Even before that. Even before it was finished, they wanted to use it. When they only had a basement, they were holding meetings.
They were holding meetings.
Right.
And then so up till the 1920s, they actually had to close the building for a little bit because it had been so long since they'd had repairs that plaster was falling off the walls and hitting people during meetings. They thought that was a bad idea.
In the minutes, the clerk, it's kind of an understatement. He said that the plaster was falling off the ceiling, which onto the stake president's office was in the tabernacle, and it was falling off the ceiling in their office, which made it very inconvenient. I thought, here's the ceiling's falling on you, and It's a little bit of an inconvenience. So actually, this was right as the Depression was, the National Great Depression was beginning. The building was in this state of disrepair. And the church architect came down to tour this building and basically said it was a shrine to the whole church. It ought to be preserved. Well, at that time, maintenance, even construction of buildings, was a local affair in many respects. And so they had to come up with sizable amounts of money if they were going to repair that building at a time when the economy was in tailspin. And they raised, I think it was $10,000 during the Depression. That's how much the building meant to them. To restore that and make it, the meeting house that they'd always met in. It was loved by the local St. George citizens. And they weren't not going to, they loved it so much, as Emily mentioned, that they loved it to death because they overused it. But they were not going to let it languish. They actually made the sacrifice to have the building put back in shape. And it's had to be restored periodically because that use continues to the present time. It's used constantly.
One of the more famous usages of that building, this St. George Tabernacle, was the scene in the church movie Windows of Heaven, where President Lorenzo Snow shows up and gives his famous talk. Mm-hmm. And it's a very beautiful structure, and I'm sure it's even more beautiful now.
You know, as Emily described it, and the craftsmanship that took place in there, that was one thing that Brigham Young emphasized. Here we had a people who had been driven from place to place. They seemed to only stay in one place for a few years, and they'd be gone. And so you had people who were looking at their stay here in St. George to be possibly temporary. Maybe they'd be forced to, you had the Utah War coming, and so Brigham Young, here he's constructing a tremendously beautiful directing that it be built. And he was also telling the people at the same time, don't build these shoddy little log houses or these little shanties. Build as if we're going to stay here for the rest of our lives. Build buildings of substance and that you'll be proud of, with beautiful gardens, and enrich this area.
And St. George has really taken that to heart. You can imagine, you go there, what it was like in 1861 when these people came and there was nothing. There's a couple of accounts of people that they drive their wagons into the valley and break into tears because it's so desolate and dry.
That was Willard Snow, a little boy, and he described his mother. And they were on this rise overlooking St. George, and there was a little clump of green down where the river was, and she asked her husband, where are we going to live? And he pointed to that little clump of green and said, right there. And she broke into tears. And little 6-year-old Willard Snow wondered why his mother was crying, because that was the first sight of greenery that they'd seen on the whole trip down from Salt Lake. So, and they did really change it.
One of my favorite places in the tabernacle is actually up in the tower. When you get to go up, very few people get to go up there. It's one of the perks of working in church historic sites. And you walk up these very tight stairs to get up there, and you can see the signatures of some of the people who built that tower. But then you get to go out and look and see what St. George is today, and you can imagine what St. George was in the 1860s and 70s. Compare what Brigham's vision for it was then compared to what it is now. And it really is a beautiful city. It's green. There are a lot of buildings, and some of them are very beautiful buildings. Yeah. And you can see that vision has come to pass.
You remember, Mike, when we were down there, and we got outside on the little parapet around the catwalk, the catwalk, and Emily was inside when the bell went off.
Yeah.
Bad idea.
I imagine her ears were ringing.
In fact, the bell and clock were one of the last items that were acquired and installed in the building. In 1871, Brigham Young came down and said, you're really going to have to finish this tabernacle. And he really wanted to finish it that year. And then he told them the reason is because you're going to also have to build a temple. And I think he was saying, these are big projects, and I really don't think you're going to be able to sustain two at the same time. So 1871, they worked feverishly to close that building up, try to finish that tabernacle. And they did get it. They did get the roof on and the walls up by the end of 71. But it took them a long time to do the finishing work. And I think in part because they were doing, as Mel pointed out, they were going to be as careful and do the best craftsmanship they could. So even the finishing work took a substantial amount of time before it was finally dedicated, which I believe was 1875 in May.
Brigham Young Jr. came and dedicated
That's right.
the tabernacle in 1875. And all of that is going on, so that finishing work is happening at the same time as they're building the temple. Brigham Young first announced the temple construction in a meeting to the church leaders in St. George in January of 71, and one of them recorded that all shouted hallelujah that this building was coming. The temple in Salt Lake was taking a very long time to get built. It started in the 1850s, and it was still not anywhere close to being finished. And I think because of Brigham Young saw the saints' devotion in St. George and saw how willing they were to lay aside everything else to build buildings for the church, and decided this was a place to build a temple, that it could be done quickly because they had the resources they needed. They had the stone, they had the wood, and they had the people willing to do it.
With expertise, because they had been spending a number of years constructing the tabernacle, learning the trades, and becoming adept at what they were doing.
Everyone seemed to be in place to make a temple.
So they announced the St. George Temple publicly in April of 1871, and then dedicated it in General Conference in April 1877. So this was a very short construction timeline, almost as fast as temples that are built today using modern technologies. And they're doing this all by hand in the 1870s. And the St. George Temple, for about 10 years, was the only temple that the church had in operation, which for Brigham Young and other people who'd been in Nauvoo and Kirtland and understood the importance of temple ordinances was probably a major source of sadness for them, to be living in a place where they didn't have full access to everything they wanted to be doing in the temple. And so when the St. George Temple was completed, the entire church showed up for the dedication. People came down from St. George, participated in the dedication ceremonies, and then stayed for a couple of weeks doing temple ordinances for their ancestors that they had never been able to do before. And this wasn't an easy journey. This would take you 2 or 3 weeks by wagon to get to St. George over, at times, very difficult roads or non-existent roads. And then you get to St. George, and there's not exactly a hotel chain set up for you. So you're camping out in a friend's front yard or sleeping in a tent or hoping that someone will take you in so you can participate in those ordinances. It was a very big deal to have that temple in St. George.
When I look at the St. George Temple, I kind of have a vision of the Nauvoo Temple. What are the similarities? What is there something there that architecture, drawings, who may have been responsible for that similarity?
There is a lot of similarities, and then there's also a lot of differences. The architect for the St. George Temple was Truman O. Angell, who had participated in the construction of the Nauvoo Temple, and some of the elements are the same. There's some, the number of stories in the structure, the symmetry of the facade, and all those kinds of things. But there are some differences. The tower, for example, is one noticeable difference between the Nauvoo Temple and the St. George Temple. And then some of the interior space is a little bit different because of how it was used. The Nauvoo Temple was mostly used for living ordinances, and the St. George Temple was the place really for the first time that we did ordinances for the dead in any kind of focused way. And so some of the interior spaces had to be a little bit different for that. But just like the Nauvoo Temple, it's a big white building that you can't help but see anywhere you are in that city. It's the St. George Temple was made of sandstone and then plastered to look white, and that actually sped up its construction a little bit. They didn't have to spend as much time finishing stone because they knew they'd just be covering it when they finished.
Tell me the story of the foundation of the St. George Temple and what it took to have a firm foundation there.
That's my...
Who wants to take it?
That's me. So the St. George Temple site, they were actually debating between a couple of different sites. There was one kind of north, in an area called the Black Hills that they were discussing for a while, and they finally settled on the site a little bit south of the center of the city. And when they started digging, they found that there were a lot of natural springs in that area, so the ground was very boggy. And then there were also some minerals in the soil that would eat away sandstone, both of which are problems when you're trying to build a foundation for a very large stone building. And so they built a pile driver. Pile drivers are usually used to make foundations for bridges and other things like that. And so they decided to make one for the St. George Temple. So they had a cannon that had been brought in for use by the militia, and so they decided to fill it with lead and then make a derrick and then just pound the volcanic rock, which St. George has in abundance, into the soil until it was stable and the water was gone and the minerals were gone. It took them several months to do this, just repetitive pounding. Every rock had to be pounded about 5 feet down before the foundation was stable enough. It was a lot of work, and Charles Walker even wrote a little song about it, which we're not going to sing. But it's a great little poem describing the construction of this pile driver and its use in building this foundation, and to create something stable so this temple could be built up on top of it. And then, you know, that cannon that was turned into a pile driver is now on exhibit in St. George. You can go down and see it in the Temple Visitor Center, which overlooks the temple, so you kind of can see the construction of this building from very initial idea all the way to its current state. It's a very interesting exhibit.
So the other two buildings in this particular guide are the Brigham Young Winter Home and the Jacob Hamlin Home. Tell us about the Brigham Young Home and why it is what it is.
Brigham Young, when he first came down in 1861, he was so impressed with that visit, and even mentioned to somebody that he had often, as a young boy, had wished he could live in a place where they could grow fruit year-round. And that fits St. George area to a T. And so, but he needed access. Being the church president, he needed communication, access to the headquarters area in Salt Lake. And so he said, well, if the Saints would build a telegraph line that enable him to get quick and easy access to headquarters, that he would extend his visits more than just his annual tours, which would only take him down there for a day or two. And so that they did. They built the telegraph line in 1867, and then I believe it was 1870 that Brigham spent his first extended visit in southern Utah. Initially, Brigham bought a home that his wife Lucy ended up living in, the Joseph Birch home. And the next year, Brigham purchased from his son, Brigham Jr., who had bought the home from Henry Lawrence. It originally had been built by James Chesney. And then Brigham, the third year, spent that year living in the new home, which is now the Brigham Young Winter Home, and spent several winters wintering over there, and his health. In his later years, he had problems with rheumatism. His feet hurt, and he would go down there in the winter months to spend it in these temperate climates and stay in his home there in St. George.
And he was friends with a lot of these residents of St. George. He had known them, many of them, since the Nauvoo years, and so it was a good chance not only for his health, but to go down and spend time with people that he knew and loved, and to interact with them in a way that he really couldn't if they were all living in Salt Lake together. So it was a more casual way to get together and to meet people. And the other primary reason Brigham Young was in St. George so much is because of the temple. It's no coincidence that he announced the temple in 71 and then spends his winters there every year until its dedication. His health was poor, and so he didn't always leave his home, but usually when he did, it involved a trip down to the temple site to supervise the construction, to cheer up the workers, or to do whatever it was that he could do to help get that temple built. And then in November of 1876, just as the temple is being finished and they're preparing for the dedication, Brigham Young built the small office next to his home. And in that office is where he started working on getting the temple ceremonies written down for the first time ever. And that office space really became the place where for the church and the temple ordinances as we know them today really got its start in St. George as Brigham Young is preparing the people for this temple dedication.
Did Brigham have a lot of family down there? I mean, do we know?
He did. He had, with a man, had many children and big families, and many of them came down to share those moments down there with him.
He had one wife who lived permanently in St. George, Lucy Bigelow Young, with her 3 daughters. And then on his trips to St. George, he would bring different family members. He would bring sometimes his wife, Amelia Folsom, or other wives, or his children would come with him. Usually, almost every trip that he came down to St. George, there was at least 3 or 4 of his family members with him, coming down to spend time with their father as he was taking a break from some of the more pressing matters of church leadership.
Let's move on to Jacob Hamlin. I know that he was a faithful member of the church and dealt with the Indians, but there's got to be more.
Yeah, he's really a remarkable individual, and in some ways, the Jacob Hamlin home is kind of it kind of sets apart a little bit from, say, the Brigham Young Winter Home and the Tabernacle and Temple. They're all directly in St. George, and Jacob Hamlin's home is actually in Santa Clara, a nearby community, so it's a little distance away. And in a way, it's a home that Jacob didn't live in very long, but it does, in a sense, memorialize the life of a very faithful Latter-day Saint who spent decades laboring among the Indians in both southern Utah Territory and northern Arizona. In the early years, in the late 1850s, it was the Paiutes primarily that he worked with. Then, beginning in 1859, and for many years after that, he would make annual trips down to the Hopi and became very, very familiar with the Arizona Strip, that whole section of northern Arizona. So much so that when John Wesley Powell was going to do his expeditions down the Colorado, Jacob was recommended as a guide, and in fact was a guide for John Wesley Powell. And Jacob did some remarkable things, not only in a sense of bringing the gospel to many of the tribes that lived down in that area, but also in arbitrating differences between encroaching settlement and Native American homelands. And it wasn't just among Mormons. All kinds of people recognized Jacob's capacity to, as a diplomat in a sense, to arbitrate difficulties. And it's hard to say, but he undoubtedly prevented a lot of bloodshed because of his efforts to arbitrate differences between new-coming settlers and these Native Americans who had lived there, since time immemorial. So,
did he have a grasp of any of the native languages?
He was better with Paiute. I don't think he ever learned Navajo. Sometimes he would have interpreters with him, but he understood Native American ways very well, felt very comfortable with them. And in some accounts, when he would go down to the Hopi, he would even, like when they would have a campsite at night, he would actually go off by himself, make his own campfire, and would sing and chant some of the Native American songs that he had learned through the years. He really was faithful in his assignment. He felt an obligation that ran deeper than what other missionaries would think. You think about a missionary, usually it's a defined set of time. You're called, you perform your labor the best you can, and you're released. Jacob never really saw it that way. For him, it was almost like a lifetime commitment that he felt compelled to pursue. And so in order to do that, he had to have some kind of a support system because he was away so much. He was the kind of man, it wasn't that he had a regular occupation. He did work when he was home. They had a peach orchard and they had cattle. But his frequent absences, oftentimes mandated absences, made it difficult for him to be around to provide. So he relied a great deal on his sons and on his wives to sort of take care of the home front. And the home itself was actually constructed in 1862-63, and Jacob's family lived there until he sold it in late 68 and moved to Kanab in 1869. So really it's the decade of the 1860s is really the time frame in which Jacob owned the home. And there's even good evidence, I think, that the home was constructed as a public works project because Jacob was gone so often he wasn't even able to construct it. And the reason it existed is because everybody in Santa Clara had to start over because in 1861 there was a terrible flood that wiped out the old fort and the entire community. In fact, Jacob himself almost drowned in this great flood. It was in January. And when the flood was over, everyone was reduced to poverty. I mean, everything was gone. They even had to replat the town at a site which was not as prone to floods as this one, although that was you could call it a once-in-a-century flood. But that's really the genesis for how the Hamlin home got built was after the old Santa Clara fort got washed away.
We kind of joke that the Jacob Hamblin home should really be the Rachel and Priscilla Hamblin home because Jacob was never there.
That's right.
We doubt he was even there when the home was being constructed. His wives probably supervised the construction and had a big part of the floor plans and the general idea of the home because they were really the ones that were managing this place and keeping the family going, keeping interactions with the local settlers going so when Jacob came home, he had some place to stay. And he had a support system while he was out. Most people really aren't aware of Jacob Hamlin's background, so I didn't really know very much about him until we started this project. So just a little bit about Jacob Hamlin. He joined the church in the 1830s in Michigan and moved to Nauvoo with his family, came on the trek west, and originally settled in Tooele. And then in 1854, he, along with about 20 other people, were called as Indian missionaries to southern Utah, and they built a fort in the area now known as Santa Clara, and started working with the local tribes.
And his family didn't come down until October of 55, so he was down there and would make occasional visits back up to Salt Lake. And when he was living in Tooele, that's when he really gained this passion that stayed with him for his life.
So most of those Indian missionaries that went to Santa Clara with Jacob Hamblin stayed maybe 2 or 3 years, and then returned to Salt Lake or northern settlements. But Jacob Hamblin's mission assignment never ended. He died in 1883.
No, it was, I think, 86.
He died in the 1880s. And as an Indian missionary, even in his later years, he was still trying to find ways to bring peace between Mormon settlers and non-Mormon settlers in the area and Indian groups. And everyone trusted him. If Brigham Young had a question about how the Southern Indian Mission was going, he would ask Jacob because he knew Jacob would give him an honest answer. If local settlers wanted to trade goods with Indians, they would have Jacob involved because both sides knew that Jacob would give them a square deal on this. Everybody trusted him. And if you wanted something settled, if you wanted a conflict resolved, if you wanted a good price on something, you went to Jacob Hamlin because this was a man that could be trusted to treat the Indians well and to treat the locals well.
So surely over the years, ownership of the Hamlin home and even maybe the Brigham Young home had changed hands. How did we gain ownership for these church sites?
Well, the Hamlin home, it's a complicated series of land transfers through the years, but eventually the Hamlin family in the early 1940s got the house back with the intention of trying to get it restored. and they approached the church about it, and the church helped them in some respects. I know there was some funds appropriated to help stabilize the home, which had fallen into disrepair. But there were ongoing problems. It had been abandoned for a while. And in fact, there's one interesting priesthood meeting in Santa Clara where the bishop is complaining about young men in town who were prone to occasionally throw rocks through the old Hamlin home windows. And one would assume that if it was occupied, they wouldn't have been doing that kind of activity. And he was trying to get to the bottom and catch these culprits and make them do what they were supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And so eventually the property was given, well, it was actually became state property and became part of I believe it was the Dixie State Park system. So it was operated as an historic site by the state of Utah from the mid-1960s until into the 1970s. And then there was an exchange of historic properties between the state and the church. And so I think it was in 1977 that the church gained ownership of the Jacob Hamlin home. And from that point on, we have been operating it as an historic site.
And saying the Jacob Hamlin home was in disrepair is an understatement. We have some photos that show one of the outside walls kind of peeling off from the rest of the building. It was about ready to fall down when the state bought the building, and they did a major restoration on it. So much of what we see in the house today was a product of what the state did in the 1960s and 70s to restore the home. The Brigham Young Winter Home kind of followed a similar path. After Brigham Young died, I'm trying to think what year it was. Do you remember?
77.
1877.
Well, what year was it sold to the next owner?
The dentist Gates, I believe, was occupied the home for many years, running his dental business out of the home, and lived it for a good long while into the 20th century. And then
he made changes to the building. So he bought the house probably in the 1880s, lived there until the 19-teens, and made a lot of changes, took walls out to accommodate his dental practice. And then when he died, I think it became an apartment building.
It was rented out as an apartment building, and then fell into disrepair, the same as the Hamlin home had. And the Young family, Brigham Young Family Association, bought it in 1955, operated it for a few years, and then the state bought it from the Young family and started restoring it. And then it became part of that package deal where the state traded the Brigham Young Winter Home and the Jacob Hamlin home for the Brigham Young Farm home up in Salt Lake. It was a trade.
As you say, very similar stories for those two structures.
Mm-hmm. And then the church has done some major restorations at the Brigham Young Winter Home in the early part of about 2000, 2001. The church did some restorations to the Brigham Young Winter Home. There were some problems with the adobe. They restored some paint colors back to the way it was, and then refurnished the structure.
And on the Hamlin home, didn't we do a seismic retrofit?
In about 2003, the church did a seismic upgrade of the Jacob Hamlin home, just to kind of get the building a little more stabilized. It's just a basic rubble stone building, so there's really nothing holding it together. And in case of earthquake in southern Utah, which is likely, we don't really want that house falling down on visitors because it would be very bad news for a lot of people. The St. George Tabernacle also had a major restoration in the 1990s, and in the middle of that restoration there was a minor earthquake in St. George that damaged the tabernacle, but because we were already working on it, we were able to do some fixes and get it back open and ready to go for visitors. And they did a seismic upgrade on that structure as well, if I remember correctly.
You three have spent a lot of time with these historic sites. Do you have a favorite story, historically speaking, of any one of these that you would like to share with our visitors?
As Emily said, we get the opportunity to sometimes go in parts of these buildings that other people don't go. I remember when we went through the Brigham Young Winter Home, going down in the basement, little dirt-floored basement. We had to duck our heads. It's not a place where the public would go, but It's fun. We have fun jobs.
I think one of my favorite spots is actually the Brigham and Winter Home office because of its connections to the temple and its meaning. It's a space that you just walk into and you don't really know what it's about, but when we started doing the research for it, it became a much more powerful story for me than a lot of the other themes that were going on in that house.
I think, in a way, I look at, say, the St. George Tabernacle, and when I first started in the project, I think, well, how remarkable can the story be? I mean, they constructed the tabernacle. And then you get into the details, and you find out what a tremendous story there is behind the building, not only in its construction, but in its ongoing use, that it did become this sort of central social center for the community, and all that implies. And I know it helps me to have a perspective, I think, on the importance of church buildings, their purpose and their meaning. It's kind of nice to reflect when you see the totality of the work that goes into these things, these historic structures. It gives you a sense of perspective and appreciation for what people in the past have done under really difficult circumstances. And it's based on their devotion and their faith. And I think that's really the thing that I appreciate the most about the sites that we currently have in southern Utah.
I'd have to agree with Mike that there's no particular story that sticks out, but just the totality of the southern Utah experience, the understanding of these people and the lives they lived and their devotion to the gospel gives me a lot of ideas and thoughts about the ways that I can be living the gospel. I may not be called to settle in an area that I don't really want to go, and I may not be asked to build a tabernacle when I have no food myself, but I can still be devoted and be willing to sacrifice and build the kingdom in good ways. It
allows for introspection. Perspective is a valuable thing. And I think when you understand the history behind these buildings and you get the perspective of what people went through to have the buildings, you tend to reflect on your own blessings in your own life and how things are for you personally on a day-to-day basis relative to what these people had. And I think that's a healthy thing.
Good, thank you. Are these sites open daily if our listeners want to go to St. George?
The sites are open daily. The St. George Temple Visitor Center is open 9 to 9 every day of the year, I think. Maybe check with them before you go down on Christmas Day. And the temple, there's a visitor center at the St. George Temple, much like some of the other visitor centers you find at temples. And then there's a small historical exhibit explaining the history of the temple. The other sites are open usually about 9 to 6 year-round, depending on when the sun goes down. And our historic buildings, we like to keep lighting that they may have used in the 19th century, which means that a tour is not really possible at 10 p.m. on a summer evening because there's just no sun. So sites are open year-round. They're free. Most tours take about 30 minutes, and the missionaries are able to answer almost any question that you come up with. If they don't know the answer, then they call us, and we get to spend a little more time
trying to provide it, if we can.
Thank you, one and all. We've been talking today with Emily Ett, Michael Landon, and Mel Bayshore. Thank you very much for being here.